Member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. His book, The Violence Inside Us, is now out in paperback as well. We thank you all for being with us this hour.
Senator, let's begin with you. Thank you so much for being with us. It seems we've been hearing over the past week that there's little to nothing that the United States can do to stop this cycle of violence. There seems to be no end game here other than Hamas continuing to fire rockets towards Israeli citizens and towns, and for Israel to target Hamas leaders that are surrounded by children and women and news outlets. Do you believe there's nothing the United States can do to step in and force a ceasefire on both sides?
Well, I do believe the United States can play a productive role here. The continued escalation of this crisis and the violence connected to it doesn't serve either party's ends. Ultimately, as you see more and more civilians being killed on both sides, it continues to fuel this grievance. It doesn't, in my mind, protect Israel in the long run if they continue to barrage Gaza with rockets, and Hamas is not going to get any closer to the negotiating table by lobbing thousands of rockets into Israel. So right now we need to focus on a ceasefire. And so you're seeing growing calls from Congress for the Biden administration to play a stronger role in pushing for that ceasefire. Last night you had the majority of the Senate Democratic Caucus sign on to a call for a ceasefire, and myself and Republican Senator Todd Young issued the first bipartisan call for that ceasefire. Listen, the United States is an important security partner for the Israelis. We are an important humanitarian partner with the Palestinians. We have leverage on both sides. And so I would hope that we would be pushing very strongly over the next 24 hours for a ceasefire.
Obviously, the Israelis have had 3,000 rockets fired their way. The New York Times this morning reporting that there's a belief among many that they're using a disproportionate force among Palestinian people. You look at the number of children and women that have been killed in these attacks. Obviously, that is a human tragedy of epic scale. And yet we don't seem, when these tragedies break out every 4, 5, 6 years, we don't seem to have a good faith intermediary that can go and get the Palestinians sitting down at the table. We have a corrupt Palestinian authority. We have Hamas, who continues to want to drive Israel into the sea. How do we rectify that situation?
Listen, admittedly, it is very difficult, given that right now, on both sides of the ledger, you don't have leadership that is able to deliver, right? You don't have an Israeli government right now, and Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition has been dependent for years on pushing the country further and further from a path to a Palestinian state. Similarly, the Palestinians are split. In fact, the reason that Hamas decided to launch these unprovoked rockets into Israel was to try to gain leverage over its rival, Fatah, the other more moderate side of the Palestinian political infrastructure. So admittedly, it's very difficult, made harder by the fact that the Egyptians and the Jordanians, two traditional intermediaries, are probably weaker and less able to bring the sides together today. But once again, I think this is a moment where you sort of have to use the leverage that we have, right? We do have leverage with the Israelis. We are an important security partner with them. The defensive mechanism, which stops many of these rockets from hitting Israel, is made possible by U.S. taxpayer funding. The aid that comes into Palestinian territories is made possible by U.S. taxpayer funding. So let's use a little bit heavier hand right now to tell both sides that now is the time to stand down, that neither side is going to be protecting their citizens in the long run by continuing this escalation.
Do you agree with the observation that Tom Friedman and so many other foreign policy observers have made that the only people who are winning politically from this are Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas?
Well, listen, somehow through this, Hamas has, convinced so many Palestinians that they are the protectors of the holy sites in and around Jerusalem. That's a disaster for Palestinians. Similarly, Benjamin Netanyahu for years has been taking steps to make a Palestinian state virtually impossible. And that's bad for both Israelis and Palestinians in the long run. Listen, again, there's a limit to how much the United States can do here. As the sort of politics on both sides gets pushed to the extreme, it does make peace harder. But this is a moment where the United States can engage, and we should.
Senator, your book is out in paperback now. Is there any hope, as there was after Newtown, that people like Pat Toomey, Joe Manchin, some Republicans and Democrats who come together at least on a common sense measure, like expanding dramatically background checks, making it universal background checks, something that almost 90% of Americans support?
Yeah, in my book, I make the case that, Democrats should admit that the Constitution includes a right to private gun ownership. And that might make Republicans a little less scared of engaging with us in talks about things like universal background checks. I also talk about the growth of the anti-gun violence movement. And what we have seen since the publication of my book is the descent into chaos of the gun lobby. So the politics on this issue are very different, which is why we are, Joe, engaged in pretty serious talks right now across the aisle on expanding background checks. And I think there's a better than 50-50 shot that we'll be able to bring a bill to the Senate floor that will save lives, that will expand background checks. And that is because the gun violence movement has become stronger. The NRA is sort of down on the mat as they go through bankruptcy proceedings. And people really believe that now is the time to get something done. So maybe it's not much greater than 50-50, but it's very different than 5 years ago when it was really impossible to get this debate started.
Well, I know, Senator, for so many people in your state, for those of us who lived in Connecticut during Newtown, for so many people across America, what a wonderful step forward that would be if the Republicans and Democrats alike could come together and give Americans what 90% of Americans support, and that is universal background checks. Thank you so much, Senator Chris Murphy. We greatly appreciate it. The book is The Violence Inside of Us, now out in paperback. Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.